Letterpress describes printing from a raised surface. So it could be lead type, it could be wood type, it could be linoleum. It's a relief process. So a raised surface, applying ink, and the paper makes contact with that raised surface and the ink gets embedded into the paper. It sort of straddles craft and commercial and fine art. It's sort of a huge continuum. It's a growing community of printers, and same thing is happening all over the place, but it's sort of busting wide open. It's strange that per capita we probably have way more letterpress printers than anywhere else. I can't explain that. Maybe it's something in the water. With letterpress printing, each letter has to be hand set, even tiny 8-point type, 6-point type. And we use a composing stick, a special tool to get that all set up. And you have a lot of nuances about, first of all, the type that you choose, and details like how it's going to work on the paper. You can choose the paper specifically to enhance the look of letterpress printing. So I like really thick, lush, handmade papers that show the impression. Offset printing doesn't have any impression, it's just flat. When I started printing 25 years ago, I was partner in a design firm and we had a press, and we started incorporating letterpress printing as part of our business. And we had to try and convince people that letterpress was awesome, and here's why you might want to pay to have your wedding invitation printed this way, and why we sent out promotional materials. So the big change in this 25-year period is people now all know what letterpress printing is. I don't have to educate anybody about it. There's a big value. And the downside is, as a printer, it's a lot more competitive. There's a lot more printers out there. But that makes me happy. I think it'll preserve the equipment and the interest. I have heard other printers worried about the bubble, that it's going to burst, like it's been this fad, and I hope that's not true.
Waste use is a funny word because it's, we don't know the etymology of it, and so it is basically a festival that a master printer put on for the underprinters, usually on St. Bartholomew's Day in August. Now, in modern times, it's kind of more just printers coming together. And in a lot of places that do waste use, they are a little more printer, and then ours is open to the public, so it's kind of showcasing the printer's art to the public. The public is very savvy. Like 10 years ago, they would ask questions about, like, oh, do you just press buttons on a machine and then, the type goes down, and it's like, no, it's all hand set, that sort of thing. And now they're pretty savvy and will come into Jessica's studio during studio tours and ask questions that I can't answer because they're that advanced. So the public knowledge has increased greatly.
When I started working on this exhibition, I knew I was going to be looking at contemporary prints, and then really started thinking about how for this community it really included letterpress, and I realized I didn't know anything about it. Thankfully, I was able to go talk to Jessica and talk about what letterpress was now and what this community, how it got started and what all was happening in the community. I knew it was very active here in Tacoma, but I was trying to look across the Northwest, and so I started looking in Portland and looking in Spokane and all out in these other areas and finding it was really active. And was really curious about how you got interested in it in the first place. sweet because I didn't know the story of how you've gotten working with it with King's Books and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, it was kind of a natural progression. At King's Books, we do a lot of work with the community in different communities, and Jessica Spring had come in installing an exhibit. So we just kind of came up with the idea. The first Wayscape was 6 tables, and then it's just gone on from there to, like, you know, over 50 artists represented and steamroller printing and everything. So it's just been kind of a natural evolution, kind of a conversation. We at the bookstore can be a place for different communities and have helped to increase the profile, I think, in Tacoma.
How many years now?
We just had our 10th, so.
Yeah, and when did the steamroller, which is always, of
That
course,
was
the high point, is the giant steamroller.
7th year?
Yeah, 6th or 7th, yeah. I think we've also seen, like, especially in the first years of the Wayscape, there'd be the curmudgeonly old printers that would come and kind of be like, what are you people doing? Kind of like testing the knowledge and asking questions in a way that we don't get as much anymore because it's kind of established itself. I mean, there's still people that come, but there was like the old guard, if you will. It was kind of like,
That's not printing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there's been education around that.
Yeah, and I think the innovation has really been rewarded with more interest from the larger community when they start to understand what we're doing and appreciate it. It's pretty exciting.
Well, what I found really fascinating about it and talking with you and then some of the other people you put me on to and then just getting out there was that how all the layers of it, that it's not just the image, it's not just the text, but that the font has a history, and that maybe even the making and the carving of the font has a history, and then the paper you choose has a history, and something in what you use to make it, or the texture of it, and then the composition itself and how things are arranged. I mean, they're so complicated in a way that people look at them, it's like, oh, nice image and a little bit of text for that poem, and how sweet that's a bird illustrating the bird poem, but there's all this other information in there too, which I think is really fascinating.
I think that's a really great point, that you can enjoy it on so many levels or get into it as deeply as you want or not. And as a maker, I love that part about it because I can totally geek out. Even if it looks like a simple composition, there's, you know, all the stuff behind it.
Your work that's in the show, Spiceography, which was this kind of tour de force, that's one of the things I love about it, is that it is all those layers, so that the fonts so it's, you know, you should describe your own work, but I love the fact, I mean, for each of the spices that you're talking about, you chose a font that has a history that relates to the history of the spice, and then you made the paper with the spice, and just love that those fonts, the letters, have a history that's just as rich as the rest of it.
What interested me and kind of got me down that path was comparing the history of spices and the history of typography, and finding that both of those valuable commodities went across all these cultures and influenced humanity, really. And so to trace that history and see the overlappage was really what got me going down that path. And then talking about taste. How do you decide what you're going to add to a dish? How do you decide how you're going to design something? And those, I realized that felt the same to me, like searching for that flavor. Yeah. So when you organized the show, it looks like you kind of divided into screen printing, fine printing, letterpress. Did you categorize? We talked about these lines being fluid, and it feels organized when you go through it.
That's funny, I was trying not to do that. I guess to some extent, yes, that there's definitely a kind of letterpress section and a book art section, and partly that just happened the way the case is laid out. But what I was really trying to do was do a cross-section through contemporary print arts today, and what kinds of interesting new techniques are people using, or materials are they printing on that are different. So would find people, it's that fluidity you're talking about that I didn't really expect to find but did. That people who were making books were also making etchings, that people were using all kinds of different techniques in their work that maybe would have been categorized before as something else. And then there were people who were doing some of both or taking it in new ways. So we were just talking about this one artist, Susan Loudermilk, who's a book artist and a printmaker, mostly in woodcuts, but she likes to also turn them into kind of 3D sculptural kinds of objects. So her books are very sculptural, but then she also made this incredible thing called a zoetrope, which for me as a 19th century geek was terribly exciting because it's like the first motion picture.
Yeah.
So it's all these prints inside a giant tub, and when you spin it, the things in the image appear to move. So the clocks go around and the horse rocks back and forth,
yeah.
which was fascinating. And then there are artists like Tina Ontko, who's doing these incredible tiny little lithographs of bugs and flowers, and they seem very kind of classic and traditional, and then she cuts them all out and obsessively attaches them each to the wall with a pin, so it's this crazy kind of physical
That's definitely
installation.
fantastic
it's
in the
beautiful,
corner.
yeah, beautiful, crazy thing.
And the shadows that it casts.
Yeah,
Makes
it's
it,
so
it moves
dimensional.
out of printmaking into installation, for sure.
And there's a lot of people moving back and forth like that, so maybe they call it a book, but it really feels like a print to most of us. Or there's that incredible book, the Oregon Pilgrimage in Green, that essentially just kind of cascades down off the wall that doesn't even feel like a book anymore. It's just this kind of sea of paper and image.
My name is Jason Skipper, and I'm a writer. A couple of years ago, I published my first novel, Hustle. I'm currently working on a memoir/biography of my father. Something that inspires my work is running. I often encounter interesting people. I'm inspired by the landscape. I just never know what's going to happen on one of those runs that could inspire a story. Running allows me to visualize scenes or chapters that I might be working on that are giving me trouble. It allows me to anchor myself in the setting, think about the characters, and go through dialogue in a way that there's not so much pressure that I feel when I'm sitting at the desk. It allows me to detach away from that. I'm drawn to characters from working class backgrounds. I think that there is a certain vulnerability that comes from being in a certain socioeconomic place, but I also really appreciate the way that communication works, the mannerisms of people from working class backgrounds, and the sense of humor and the unique sense of beauty that these people find in unique places. And I see a lot of that in the people of Tacoma. And when I'm out on my run, I encounter situations that remind me of that.
Fracking is personal and dear to me because it's happening all over the United States. And for me, I wanted to create a piece about fracking, drilling for natural gas, because it's happening where I grew up. It's a very controversial issue. There are positives and negatives to the issue. And as an artist, I wanted to explore that topic in a bunch of different ways. But primarily, I wanted to talk about the environmental impacts. The first section of What the Frack is environment in its natural habitat that is introspective and quiet and healthy. In my head, I just really saw all of the action moving from stage left across to stage right as a series of solos or small, quiet duets. And the idea was that the dancers were creating this very introspective, healthy, internalized movement that was natural. Not that they were particularly animals in the woods, but that their solos were healthy. And then the second section for me is really, although it's the most abstract in some ways, it's really the most concrete movement kinesthetic idea. It's the drilling piece. So the very first part, you'll see the dancers up on their toes and leaning forward, and that for me is the search for oil, or in this case, the search for natural gas. The third section for me, in some ways, is the most fun, and for me this is perspective of social voices. So there's this controversial topic, and there are many people that feel very differently, and each voice is valid but different. And so it's what I call my social commentary. It's I need to have my voice heard and be put out there, and it's very exaggerated and expressive and overdone, but each voice is trying to get the other group to listen to them, but my point is valid. And so it's this constantly talking at each other but not really ever coming to any kind of an agreement. And then finally, section 4 it comes back to section 1, and I wanted it to really be an exact replica of section 1, except that maybe now that all the chemicals have gone into the ground, and now that we don't know what the future is because there hasn't been quite enough research to say what's going to be happening, that maybe that environment's not as healthy as it once was.
Robin approached me at the end of last school year about doing a project. She had used a couple of my pieces in the past for pieces that she was putting together, and she asked if I would be interested in working on a full-length, several movement work, and I said, of course, I'd be thrilled to. I went in basically with no preconceived ideas. I asked Robin basically what it was that she wanted to convey with the project, and then I had her be as descriptive as possible with what she wanted to do, and then I tried to make the music fit that as best as I could with my ability as a writer. I wouldn't say I have a set creative process other than thinking about the subject matter that I'm trying to convey, and then coming up with music, whether it be a chord progression or starting with a chord progression, or sometimes it'll start with a melody, or sometimes start with a drum feel or something that kind of conveys that idea, and then build off of that and then flesh out the idea as it kind of grows. So it starts with one of those initial components, whether it's melody or harmony or rhythm. It will always draw from some sort of inspiration, something that like a moment in my life that has occurred that means something to me, and I try to capture that with sound. So for this project, it was taking Robin's ideas and how she felt about the given topics or movements, and then trying to capture that with sound. My goal for this piece was to take Robin's ideas and stay as true to they were, as true as she specified them. So I guess in essence, make the music, take the music and write the music and make it sound exactly like, as close as possible to what she wanted. There was no doubt in my mind that if I did a good job, that her ideas would come out the way she depicted them, both in the dance and also through the sound of the music.
My goals for the project were sort of twofold. Artistically, I didn't have a sound in my head. I'm not a composer, and I couldn't even fathom what that was like. But I definitely had very clear ideas I wanted to portray through each section. And so I tried to use as many descriptor words as possible to talk to Kareem, and he would ask clarifying questions so that he could, as an artist himself, create what that might be. And then he would come back and play some things for me, and we would hone in further and talk further. Students at SOTA are relatively aware of social justice issues. We teach a lot of social justice issues at SOTA, and so being able to create an art piece that they see as an instructor is close to my heart and something that's happening, even though it's not happening right here in Tacoma where they live, lets them gain awareness. And I would say they're already relatively aware of environmental issues or other social justice issues. I think that they felt very invested in this piece because I think young people of today, and certainly my dance students who performed in this piece, I think they want to approach the world as I can be the change. And whether it's making art, which is, I hope, how I'm encouraging them as an instructor, that is voicing opinions out there, or just offering an opinion for social justice issues, or whether they go explore other more scientific or more academic ways. I think it's benefited them, and I definitely see that they care about it. They really care about this piece, and they are fully invested in it.
My name is Antonio Gomez, and I'm a percussionist. My work focuses on cultural dialogue. So for me, music is very social. It's a platform for people to connect with each other. As a percussionist, I see my role not only as to create rhythm and keep time, but also to create color and ambiance. And so I draw on musical traditions from around the world. I focus mostly on Afro-Latin music and Mediterranean music. And what I mean by Mediterranean music is music of Spain and Italy, as well as North Africa and the Middle East. This creative space is about including artifacts and art from some of my travels and some of my study in different corners of the world, but also having wide open windows that remind me of where I am and give me a sense of place in the Northwest, where I can see evergreen trees, but I can also see the industrial edge of Tacoma. And all of those things come together. They inspire me. They allow me to think back on my travels and think about the places I've been and the place where I am, and find how there are some common strands of human experience between these places and these peoples. A lot of my music focuses on the space between different cultures and different experiences, different ideas. As someone who grew up with family that come from different parts of the world, I've always been situated between different cultural experiences. And so this is really important to me in my art, to explore those spaces, that idea of having one foot in one place and one foot in the other. And sometimes those places are a market in Morocco or a coastal village in Panama. I consider myself a student of this huge wealth of knowledge that exists around the world. Every community has created its own sense of musical tradition. And you can even go from one village to the next village, 10 kilometers down, and find a completely different tradition. The question that I'm always asking is, how can I learn from and honor the traditions that I encounter? And then how can I use them as a vocabulary to talk about our common global experience in this 21st century?
Nancy Rosalind Bell. I am a writer. I do all kinds of writing. In Tacoma, primarily I'm known as a playwright, but I write short stories. I'm at work. If you've known me for any amount of time, you know that I'm at work on a novel. We're on the gorgeous campus of the University of Puget Sound. What's special about this particular spot is this gorgeous sun we have today, and we walk 5 feet either way, and we are surrounded by the shade of lovely trees. I come to write, and I come with that intention always to write. Okay, that sounds like, oh, that's very easy. It's not at all. I sit down and I stare, into the void, and I just make peace and hope that something's there to write that day that has something to do with something. It's quite open, beautiful, lush. There are nooks and crannies, which as a writer I love. It's a place that provides a certain degree of safety in the physical sense and also in the sense of a black woman in the world. This is a campus that every 4 years is the Race and Pedagogy Conference. So they have invested in race and pedagogy as important for our country and our world.
Hammett was a writer, an important American writer, really, in the kind of golden age of American literature. I mean, Dashiell Hammett, his real name was Samuel Dashiell Hammett. Hammett goes ahead and writes, a couple of novels, writes 100 short stories and 5 novels, actually. He finally gets around in 1924 to writing The Maltese Falcon, and I think that generally is viewed not only as his masterpiece, but one of the really great works of American fiction during that time. Talk about a page-turner. That book just flies through. There's only 2 places in The Maltese Falcon where the story pauses to kind of let the reader catch their breath. And this was an obvious cut when John Huston made The Maltese Falcon into a movie in 1941. Sam Spade is sitting in a hotel room talking to Bridget O'Shaughnessy, waiting for another character, and they're just passing time. And for no really explainable reason, he tells her this story, which today is now referred to as the Flitcraft Parable, which is this very, very modern, existential, very much in a realist style. It's almost in a different literary style. Mm-hmm. But he tells her this story that Sam remembered from an earlier case where Spade had been hired by a woman to trace down a former husband.
Yeah.
And
a current husband.
Yeah.
At the time. Yeah.
And the story is set in Tacoma, Washington. Mm-hmm. And it's a story about a guy, of upper middle class guy who's got a fancy car and wife and kids.
Yeah, 2 kids, 2 boys and a wife. Yeah, that's the one that I illustrated, and it is one of the 2 pauses in the story, and it's interesting in that even though it, in addition to it being different, a pause in the story, it's also a break in how Spade talks, because Hammett says that Spade he just starts into the story. It's like the chapter starts, and then Spade sits Bridget down, and begins to tell the story in a way that he's never told the story before.
The Flitcraft parable, which is about this guy standing on a street corner in front of a building that's incomplete and having a beam fall from 15 stories up, come right down and narrowly miss him, and chip off a piece of the sidewalk that fires up and cuts his face. Flitcraft just leaves. He has this moment where he could have died and he didn't, and so he figures everything else around him, it isn't relevant anymore. His world has just changed, and he walks down to the train station at Union Station, gets on a train, and doesn't call his wife, doesn't check in, leaves behind his golf appointment that afternoon, leaves his car behind, and jumps on and disappears.
Yeah.
Hammett was, I was born in Baltimore, and sort of as a young man dropped out of school and ended up kind of working through a bunch of different jobs, eventually working for the Pinkerton Detectives, which was, in those days, in the early part of the 20th century, was mainly sort of private police and a little bit of thuggery, for a fee. Not only was he in the First World War, but he got flu during the influenza epidemic of 1918, which aggravated into tuberculosis. And as a young veteran after the war, went the Pinkerton job after the war took him out to Spokane and then into the kind of struggle in the minefields of Montana. By 1920, he is really taken down by tuberculosis. He's, at 26 years old, he is referred to the medical hospital, the newly built public health hospital in Tacoma. In early November, winter of 1920, got off the night train from Spokane and arrived, probably a rainy night, and walked off the train and stood there in front of Union Station and took the streetcar up to the hospital, checked in, and then that winter of 1920-1921, young Samuel Hammett spent in Tacoma. He landed in Tacoma at a time in 1920 where he just happened to drop into a city in a dark, wet winter where Tacoma was descending into a period in its own history that was just unlike any time before since Prohibition had started in 1916. Tacoma was a huge town for breweries, so that industry was in collapse. Organized crime and corruption within the city had really taken over the elected officials, and the upstanding organizations in the city in many ways were just as broken and corrupt as the gangsters and the organized crime that was starting to really get fully blown around Prohibition. And Tacoma was a city that prospered on adult entertainment and just the kind of dark side of human behavior, and for a young 26-year-old artist to step into that and be inspired by that is just, it must have been overwhelming for him. And looking back, I mean, you can kind of imagine him following the days. A couple of big events occur during that winter. A 49-year-old mill worker, a carpenter who worked out in the mill on the port, lived up on the hilltop, which was kind of working class in those days. He decided to walk down to a newsstand that his two older sons kept down at 19th and Jefferson in what would today be the middle of the University of Washington, Tacoma. And he decided to go out, a little bit unusual. His wife cautioned him, you know, be careful out there, there's robbers on the street. But he walked down the hill going to meet the boys down there, and he got down to near 19th and Jefferson, and a young police officer named Kraft, Officer Kraft, had just picked up a report of an armed robbery. He was coming from the call box, and he saw the mill worker, was a perfectly innocent guy, but who at the time must have just had in the back of his mind that the caution of his wife. And so he heard the voice of the police officer yelling at him, and the police officer was in a dark tunic and just kind of yelled at him to stop, and instead of stopping, he started to run. And ran down behind got down to about where the Harmon building, the backside of the Harmon building today in the heart of the campus. And Officer Kraft pulled out his service revolver and fired in the air a couple shots. Didn't stop, so he, the next purely cautionary shot, he fired into the sidewalk, into the street. And just on a complete random fluke, the bullet hit the granite curbstone and ricocheted up. It was over 100-yard shot, so a long, totally unintentional shot. The bullet came up, went into the ribs of the 49-year-old mill worker, and 20 minutes later he was dead. The mill worker's name was Samuel Hamblett. So with the exception of one letter being different, it was the same name because Dashiell Hammett would only use Dashiell as his name, as a pen name. His name at the time, everybody called him Sam, and he was Samuel Hammett. So you can imagine on the morning of the 15th, picking up the newspaper and reading this story about, first of all, seeing your name, that you're dead, on the front page of the paper, and then reading the details of how it was a random, totally by chance kind of shooting. On the corner of 11th and Pacific downtown, the sort of A corner, the busiest, most important corner in the city on Pacific Avenue, the tallest building ever built in Tacoma was under construction. It was the Scandinavian American Bank building. And Scandinavian American Bank in those days was the biggest bank in town. 1 in every 8 people in Tacoma kept their money in the Scandinavian American Bank. They were the bankers for the city of Tacoma. The governor kept his money there. I mean, it was the prestigious bank in town, and they were building the biggest skyscraper ever built in the city in 1920. The steel frame of the building was all pretty much in place, and then in January of 1920, all of a sudden one day, nobody showed up for work. Everybody thought it was strange. I mean, work stopped so abruptly that the steel girders, 20 stories up in the air, 18 stories up in the air, they didn't even hammer over the rivets holding the girders in place. Work stopped so quickly. And it turned out that Ole Hansen, the president of the bank, had been using depositors' money to build the building, and the money had run out. Huge scandal. Most of the 1920s, the busiest intersection in Tacoma was loomed over by the skeleton of an incomplete fiasco of a project. And Hammett would no doubt have noted that amid the times when it seemed like all of the dastardly bootleggers and gangsters that were running the speakeasies and stuff were pulling off crimes, they were petty compared to what was going on with the most prestigious, highest ranking people in the whole you know, in the whole city. He stood there at 11th and Pacific at that uncompleted building that was, you know, it was corrupt in a political and in a social way, whereas in the Footcraft Parable it's a physical way where the beam falls because the building doesn't have integrity, doesn't have structural integrity.
And it doesn't care.
In real life, it doesn't have integrity of the people, of the leadership of the city that owned it. And then the whole fact about that mill worker with his name getting killed by a random bullet that just bounces up off the street, and you wonder. And that's the moment in Footcraft Parable where he's just kissed by fate, you know, that little.
Yeah, I think so. It's just a big, you know, it could be seen as like it's a big corrupt, uncaring world, not necessarily that's out to get you, but, you know, it's definitely not out to save you. I like the way Hammett went about describing the characters. He was both very clear about some of the features, but then he would also throw in some wording that described the character in a way that wasn't visual. So he described Spade as being, you know, all of his features coming to a V, like his hairline, his ears were somewhat pointed. He said he looked somewhat like a blonde Satan. So when I was drawing Spade, I tried to give him that sort of blonde, devilish look. It's not a long form thing. I mean, originally it was just done to accompany the editorial. It was part of the overall editorial piece on Hammett, and so it was just to show you, you know, Hammett's sort of take on Tacoma, and, you know, give you a sort of a sampling of how he wrote and what it was like, and, you know, and the parable. I did some experiments, and I found that I didn't want the colors to be very bright or very well done. Again, it's like I wanted to keep it cheap and sort of pulpy, and then the way that the colors were applied also made it look really kind of rushed and again cheap, because they were instead of following the edges nicely, all of the color shapes were cut out and applied very, very quickly and very fast. So it was all, you know, done to sort of replicate what was available or possible at the time, and all done in the service of telling the story, because a big part of making all of those decisions as far as the type of line work, the way the characters are drawn, the color, the lettering, the balloons, everything like that, all goes into visually creating a piece that when you look at it, it suggests a certain feeling, a certain atmosphere, so that you don't almost have to read the story to find out what kind of story it is. You can actually just sort of look at it and get a feel for, okay, yeah, this is a gritty, there's a grittiness to the story, and it's not overproduced and it's not overdone, and you know, it's a very sort of Noir thing. The parable, my adaptation of it, is fairly colorful as far as Noir comics go, but I think it's the texture and the characterization that sort of pulls off that Noir psychology. So that's what I was going for when I did that.
Today, now, people that are trying to look at Dashiell Hammett as an important literary figure, and just the advances he made in literature and popular culture in America, really, or in the world for that matter, everybody wants to kind of find, what's this guy about? Where's he coming from? What's it all about? And now, historians and literary critics, in fact, one of the best biographies of Dashiell Hammett is called Falling Beams, and basically takes the Flitcraft parable and it says, look, you know, if you want to understand this writer, understand the core ethic, the core values of Dashiell Hammett and really projected large of noir fiction in general, look at the Flitcraft parable, read the Flitcraft parable.